A short disclaimer that for all of you lovely people who weren't in the overproduced anime intro, it's because sadly we ran a little bit short on time. On with the show. There were some constraints in the production, namely, I do play other games and sadly they had a few interesting DLCs this week. I may have waited a bit too long to start collecting my own consumables, and I may also have gotten a bit sidetracked working on the overproduced anime trailer with Shirazi. Even so, we got it done, but we had to cut a few corners. To help us cut corners, we enlisted the help of Zaknafian. As you know, Naxx has a lot of bosses, but by cleverly disguising them as Veilstras, we just knew that Zaknafian couldn't contain his trigger finger. As such, he helped us in eliminating most of those pesky, annoying bosses that I do not
accidentally
have the
pull a
time to
boss
cover
once.
now. As such, if you don't see one of your favorite bosses in the video, it's because they will not be covered. Now, on with the rest of the programming. The bosses we will be covering are Maexna, Gluth, Thaddeus, of course the Four Horsemen, and maybe Kel'Thuzad, if time permits. Spoiler, time does not permit. Now, we're going to be talking about alternate tactics in this video, not the stupid ones that you find online. Some of you might be saying, but Valdemar, why would we need alternate tactics to begin with? After all, we have a guide of our own, written by none other than Solor. As with Valdemar, I would like to point out that beautiful though Solord's guide may be, meta tends to have its own way of dealing with things. And so I thought it might be useful to discuss a meta for meta.
Oh my god.
Let's
not
get
wrong,
started then.
though.
First off, we enter the lair of the fierce Maexna. Now, I'm going to be talking about these encounters as if we've already tried them and sadly wiped. So Maexna is going to be wise to our coming. As such, we need to confuse the creature. I propose that we send in the distraction gnome, Bundvalk, and tie a bit of meat around his neck. The confused distraction gnome will enrage Maexna, and while Maexna is feasting on his body and doing unspeakable things to our mage class leader, we can get our DPS in position to lay on the hurt. Before Maexna loses threat and interest in the corpse of Bundvalk, we'll send in our secondary distraction gnome and honorary main tank, Vildnemda. He will further distract the beast. After laying a bit of additional DPS on Maexna, it is then imperative that some of our DPS disguise Maexna as that fucking bitch Carol Baskins. This will, of course, enrage our local Tiger King, Hezekiah, who will engage in titanic combat with Stretcher, destroying it utterly. The rest of us can then loot its corpse. This concludes victory against Maexna. Now, Meta as an organization is not without a heart. Maexna was a single mother and she leaves behind a lot of children. Luckily, we have our priest class leader, Sergeant Jam, who is a very big spider aficionado. No doubt many of you have seen him and his trusty spider companions in raids. He will be adopting all of Maexna's leftover spawn. Hooray for the children. Moving on to the terrible Gluth. Conveniently, Gluth has already moved to the top of the room where we will be tanking him. As we emerge from the far tunnel, we're going to be very conventional and send in our normal main distraction gnome Vildnemda, who will tank him in the correct spot, followed by the rest of the raid, and of course the secondary distraction gnome and all the other mages, who will be kiting all of Gluth's zombies. It is imperative that we position Shahin close enough to Gluth, the cause of which will become clear later. As we fight Gluth as you would normally, Gluth will unleash his devastating roar Decimate. This is his big mistake. After all, this will awaken Shahin. Now, Shahin may have been asleep for the last 3 raid tiers, but that has given him all the time he needs to channel all his power. As such, when he finally awakens, it will be a climactic awakening, and his power will be uncontested. Shahin will spread such potent rejuvenation throughout the raid that fighting us becomes completely pointless. Gluth goes into an existential crisis and flees the scene, allowing us to progress through Naxxramas. Gluth, meanwhile, will take up a monastic life of quiet contemplation after his long and painful existential crisis. Moving on to the next boss, Thaddeus. Now, I sure hope we're not going to wipe on Thaddeus, competent raiders as we are, but there's always the possibility. As such, the fight is going to start, with getting shouted at by Dadcake for fucking up previous attempts, even though the boss was piss easy. The second part of the tactics being self-explanatory. Don't be a fucking retard this time, and know left from right. If you do that, you will obtain victory. This concludes Thaddeus. Now we move on to the highly anticipated Four Horsemen. I'm sure nothing could possibly go wrong with our crack raiding team on the Four Horsemen, but just in case, I included this segment. Now, do know we'll be looking at the bottom part of the room, considering most of what goes on is mirrored in the top half of the room. Our honorary tank stand-ins are Wildnemda, Robin, Rexy, and Dorota. As we pull the Four Horsemen, each of the first wave of tanks will take his own horseman and bring him to the assigned corner. The secondary tanks will wait a moment in the safe spot. Once the main tanks have built up enough stacks, the secondary tanks will come in, taunting the respective horsemen and allowing the main tanks to rest in the safe spot until 3 more stacks have passed. This cycle will then repeat, with the tanks switching to another horseman and allowing the secondary tanks to go to the safe spot. Is everyone still following? I sure hope so. Once this cycle has completed enough times, we just need to rinse and repeat, if we would be doing normal tactics. During normal tactics, all our DPS have spread across the room. But for these vastly superior tactics, we're going to need all additional DPS to pile on top of Mograine and pop all their trinkets and cooldowns. We're going to be nuking the High Lord. Once Mograine has been utterly decimated by our cracked DPS, he will drop his corrupted Ashbringer. This is when the healers step up, retrieving the corrupted Ashbringer. We will bring the corrupted Ashbringer to the center of the room to start Phase 2. During Phase 2, half of our healers will start a cleansing ritual. Once the cleansing ritual has begun, a roll will happen to see who becomes the new Ashbringer. Oh look, what a surprising outcome. This will be followed by a cataclysmic holy ritual. And from the dust, the new Ashbringer emerges. Huzzah! Now, if we put on our RP hats and look at the item description for the corrupted Ashbringer, we see that the wielder becomes the de facto High Lord of the Scarlet Crusade. This is key to the strategy, as he will call for a final crusade against the remaining horsemen. The rest of the raid continues their rotation, while the entirety of the Scarlet Crusade runs into the room, running into the horsemen, destroying them utterly. Thus we will have obtained glorious victory, and all the loot shall be ours. Now, this is the part where I'd continue. But first of all, a shout out to my paladins. This PowerPoint was mainly made for them, and it would have been more about them, but then pesky ideas and the rest of the guild got in the way. I'd like to thank all of you for sticking with me throughout all these times, and for all the memories we've built up with Meta. Now, I know all of you are asking, where is KT, Valdemar? Do you have a KT? The answer is no. No, I do not yet have a KT, but who knows what might yet come in the next weeks. Now, without further ado, bugger off and let's go raid.
Thank you. Very nice.
Thank
Hey.
you. Very good. Speech.
That was beautiful.
Guess what?
My PowerPoint is a ploy to get Valdemar his ass bringing.